Good afternoon, dear students, alumni, and guests. Some of you know me, but let me introduce myself to those of you who have not met me yet. My name is Grażyna Rębielak. I'm Executive MBA and MBA Programs Director at Warsaw University of Technology Business School. On behalf of the school, I would like to warmly welcome you to the first inspirational lecture, which is a part of a series of lectures being delivered by us and by our partners. I want to welcome students and alumni of our university, Warsaw University of Technology Business School, and all the guests of our partners, the University of Salford in Manchester, the Management Center in Innsbruck, Baltic Management Institute in Vilnius, Polimi Graduate School of Management, Politecnico di Milano, and Zicklin School of Business, Baruch College, New York City University. The first inspirational lecture will be delivered by Professor Witold Orłowski tonight. I would like to wish you a good time, and please feel also free to be invited to our next lecture, which Dr. Paweł Urbański will deliver on 22nd of June. Witold, you are more than welcome to start your lecture. Enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. So let me start. Let me share the screen with you. The lecture will be about Europe and about the economics of the development of Europe. On the one hand, Europe is one of the most developed regions of the world. On the other hand, if you hear the Europeans, they are complaining. They have been complaining all the time, especially over the last 20 years or 25 years, about Europe not performing as well as you could expect it to perform. So basically, it will be some remarks about why Europe is performing the way it is, and can it be changed? We'll discuss the strong points, the assets, the liabilities of Europe, if you wish, and it will be the kind of invitation for the discussion about the topic that you see here. Is Europe a good place for business? Okay. First of all, let's have a look at this at the historic perspective, okay? This is the graph that's showing you what had been the share of Europe in the global GDP over the last, 500 years. And as you see, it's interesting also to look at three other key economic areas, let's say, meaning India, China, and the North America, means USA and Canada. Mexico, I do not add to it as being more part of Latin America than North America. Okay, and as you can see, Europe at some point was reaching almost 40% of the global GDP. At the beginning, China, India were more than half of the global GDP. Europe was only 20% in the year 1500. But now Europe is only 18%. The US is more or less the same 18%. China, after having been downgraded to some less than 10%. Now it's the same, more or less the same 18% that the US and Europe. However, the share of China is growing, and the share of USA and Europe is falling. India is improving a bit its position, but still it's much smaller than used to be in the history. So basically, we're interested in Europe, right? We will discuss about Europe. So the question is, what has happened? Europe used to be the leader of the economic growth. Let's say the West in general, but Europe especially. And in a sense, it became a laggard in the economic growth. Okay, you can say Europe is so rich that it doesn't need as much growth as, I would say, Africa or Asia. And that's partly true. However, Europe is also developing on a slower path, painfully slower path than the United States, for example. And here the argument is important, doesn't help. And US is as rich or even richer than Europe and still developing faster than Europe. So why? If you look once again at the past, I mean, there were the periods when, Europe was really leading the pack. Okay, the United States, Canada have been developing faster, mainly due to European investment, but from the very low level. So that's why the rates of growth are so big in the case of America until 1950. But basically, the old economic powers, India and China, have been developing much slower than Europe in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century. Obviously, the first half of 20th century was a period of wars and so on. But later, after the wars, Europe was developing pretty well. And in the last 20 years, we see Europe clearly being a laggard, right? The fact that China and India are growing very fast, well, that's understandable in a sense. They are still converging. They are still making up for the time that have been lost somewhere in the past. But you see the difference between the United States and Canada on the one hand and Europe on the other hand. It may not be a huge difference, the growth rate, but it's, I would say, a painful difference for Europe, because Europe is trying to look, to match America, to match the United States in the economic development. This is about the GDP. But obviously, in the modern economics, we are not talking really about the GDP itself only, but about the technology, about the technological progress, about the productivity, about the use of the new technologies, and so on and so on. And here, you can see even more problems for Europe. Means the US is, in a sense, shining as a center of the knowledge, while Europe is feeling that it's lagging behind. Okay, well, we'll have a look at this in a moment. But when Europe became a leader, well, maybe there is some lesson from the history of Europe. First, why Europe became a leader. Well, compare China and Europe in the history, and you will see that all the major, inventions that, in a sense, were shaping our technology and so on, have been invented in China a couple of hundred of years before they had been invented in Europe. So the paper around 1,000 years earlier than in Europe, the print 400 years, the gunpowder the same, the compass 200 years, and so on. And in a sense, in the year 1800, China was still a technological leader, and Europe was a country trying to converge to China. There's a famous story, well described, about the first British ambassador to China. I mean, the King George III sent Lord Macartney to China with some gifts to the emperor and with a proposal to start a trade. It was in the year 1793. And first, there was a lot of the misunderstanding because the Chinese wanted him to the ambassador to bow, to lie face down before the emperor, and the British were telling no, so they have been negotiating. Finally, they agreed that he kneels only behind during the audience, the ambassador. But the bigger differences and misunderstandings were that the Chinese were absolutely sure that the British ambassador came here to pay the tribute to the emperor from his vassal, the king of England who wants to be his vassal. And actually the gifts that the ambassador brought to the emperor, I mean, the Chinese thought at the beginning that they were this tribute payments simply from the vassal. Once both sides understood the misunderstanding, they looked at the issue, and actually the Chinese officials answered in a letter to the English king that you see the quotation from that letter: our empire possesses all the things in abundance and lacks no product. There is no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. Why this answer had been given? Because really at that time, and that was 1793, basically the Chinese products were by higher quality, more technologically advanced. There was almost nothing they could have imported from Europe. Actually, some 40 years later, the British finally found a product they could sell to India, but to China, but it was a sad story, because they finally found out that it's possible to grow opium in India and to export it to China. Once China objected against that, the British sent the fleet. And 40 years after this visit, 45 years, the British fleet destroyed in one day the whole Chinese fleet, and the British won the Opium War, the first Opium War, because during these 40 years there was such a huge increase of the gap, technological gap between Britain and the West and Europe and China, that the Chinese army didn't have any, Chinese army didn't have any chance to stop the British. So even if in the year 1793, China was still ahead of Europe, 45 years ago, China was falling back as a technologically backward country. And then there came the political, the economic decline of the huge empire. And by the end of the day, China narrowly escaped becoming a European colony. So basically, why China did not make the advantage of all these inventions, technologies that they did possess, why once they had the gunpowder 400 years before the Europeans, why in the year 1840 their fleet was so defenseless against the British guns? Well, because of the fact that in China, the technology was not being changed into the innovations, into the general use innovations. There were the toys, the print was a toy for the mandarins around the emperor. The compass was the toy for the emperor. The gunpowder was a toy for soldiers, and so on and so on. And basically, the issue was that Europe became a technological leader of the world because there were the conditions, the economic freedom, the intellectual freedom, the conditions in the 18th, 19th century that allowed all these inventions to change into innovations, social innovations, to change the society, to be used popularly, to be used in businesses and so on and so on. And here you've got the Gutenberg who invented the print, but this print in Europe led to the French Revolution, led to the massive education, led to the industrial revolutions, and so on and so on. And in China, in a sense, it stopped in the court of the emperor. So that's a big lesson, and that's the lesson about the future. I mean, if Europe wants to become a leader once again, it should understand that the leadership today in the field of economy is connected with the proliferation of the new technologies, the newest technologies, not with the production itself, but with the new technologies. In a moment you will see, but first obviously, should say that in Europe there was first, in the 20th. The 20th century was a dramatic century for Europe. And first there was the explosion of aggressive nationalism that actually led to two world wars that really ruined Europe. And moreover, it left, in the middle of the century, Europe divided by the Iron Curtain. So in a sense, you can say that half of Europe, I mean, this eastern half of Europe was cut by the Iron Curtain from the normal ties, normal developments of the European countries, and in a sense they become impoverished and extremely poor until the Iron Curtain of the Berlin Wall finally was demolished. And the reconstruction of Europe after this fall, dramatic fall, started with the European integration, the Treaty of Rome that started what we know today as the European Union in 1957. And then the fall of the Berlin Wall, with all the problems connected with the reunification, economic reunification of Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall. That the most clearly had been visible in the case of Germany itself, I mean, being divided into two countries and then paying a fortune to make the eastern part of the country approach the levels of the economic development similar to western part of the country. Some countries were more successful in this, some were less. In Poland, we basically reduced by half the gap, the income gap vis-à-vis the West that we had in 1989. In some countries, it was less. We'll come back to this issue a bit more later, but obviously the lesson was once again, I mean, the production is one thing, but the people, the technology, the knowledge, the entrepreneurship is actually something much more, I mean, maybe not much more important, but at least equally important as money. Germany was, at the moment of the unification of Germany in 1990, was the richest country in Europe, with the biggest resources in Europe, and they put into operation tremendous resources to make Eastern Länder developing as fast as possible. And actually, without a success. I mean, with a limited success, with huge resources as a very disappointing result. Why? Because the money is not the solution. The money is a tool, right? The capital is a tool. I mean, if you've got businessmen able to build new businesses, to use new technologies, you've got entrepreneurs and so on, then give them the money and they will make a good use of that. But if you've got, and that was the story with the Communist Party, that people, especially in some countries in East Germany, were deprived of any entrepreneurial spirit and so on, and then giving them just the money was not a solution, was not solving the problems. But still, the year 2000, after Europe has been reunified, early 21st century, there was the enlargement of the European Union. So the first countries that were behind the Iron Curtain joined the European Union. And it looks as if Europe was on the safe side of the history, but still, relatively slow, many problems of the European Union, multiple crises, including the Greek and the Southern European debt crisis, including the Brexit, if you wish, obviously, as a political crisis for the Union, and so on and so on. And nowadays, obviously, the security crisis, the biggest security crisis in our. Remember the Russia's aggression of Ukraine. So this is where Europe stands now. And maybe a few words about the war, because I'm not too sure if I don't touch this issue now, you will ask you raise in questions. So maybe some information before we can obviously come back to this issue later. So what the impact of the war on well, as everywhere, but in Europe especially, the huge increase of the energy prices and food prices. The economists call such a situation the supply shock. The supply shock is a problem connected with the dramatic reduction of the supply of a given important production input or raw material or a kind of a product, leading to the huge increase of prices. I mean, the prices of the oil and gas more or less doubled over last year, mainly due to the war. Actually, it seems that Russia started some speculation even before the war started. So in any case, there was a huge increase of the energy prices, obviously worldwide, because the spot prices of the oil and gas reacted to everything. But in Europe, it was especially painful because of the dependence of the Russian gas and oil. Then obviously we've got the food price increase once again globally, because Ukraine and Russia deliver something like 1/3 of all the supply of the grain, of the cereals for export for the global markets. So we started already. We already see the increase of the prices, but it's not the end of the story. Basically, all over the world there's a hike of inflation. Well, here I must say that in a sense Europe is not more touched than the other areas. I mean, in the United States, the inflation increased as much as in Europe, in many European countries. But in any case, the problem is for everybody, but especially for Europe. There is obviously the very supply shock and the increase of prices of oil and gas and food on the top. It doesn't mean the long-term inflation. It's a hike in inflation. It may be temporary, but there is always a risk of kind of a repetition of the bad memories from the 1970s, forming a so-called inflationary spiral, the wages prices spiral. The economists prefer to call it the second round effects. You know, the initial increase of prices after, there was some shortages of gas and food. It's a first round effect. And the second round effect is when the wages prices spiral forms. So, workers demand the price increase, the wage increase, that increases are given to them, but the producers must increase their prices. So the wages, the workers have new demands for more wage increase. You can also call it the inflation expectation mechanism. In any case, it made it Europe especially, but frankly speaking, the risk is for the whole world, to the period of so-called stagflation. This is the set remaining of the set memory of the 1970s. Stagflation means a very slow growth connected with the inflation. Normally in the economy, you've got one of the problems at the time. Means if your economy is growing fast, if there is a big increase of the demand, then you've got the problems with the inflation. But if the economy is slowing down, you don't have the problem of the inflation. You may even have the problem of deflation. It's falling prices. But the stagflation is something especially nasty because it's a slow growth connected with the inflation. And the problem is that this is a situation where, for example, the central bank doesn't have a good way out, because the central bank normally is using the interest rate tool to fight the inflation. And because of the high inflation, it should increase the rates. But because of the high unemployment and slow growth, it should cut the rate. So stagflation is a moment when the bank doesn't have a good move. Depending, and it's trying, and during the 1970s, the central banks have been trying to find some compromise. And actually, by the end of the day, it was the only way was to get rid of the inflation through a huge recession worldwide. So we'll see what will going to happen. Obviously, the story with Russia is over. Russia, first of all, militarily, the war is not over. But then we don't know what will be the development of the trade war between the EU, Europe, well, the United States as well, obviously, and Russia. We don't know. Most likely, Russia will react to the sanctions, but counter sanctions, and that may lead to the trade war. I said for the United States as well, but for the United States, Russia is a marginal export market. While for the European, for the German enterprise and so on, it's a sizable, it's an important market with an important effect for the economy. They further go to the east of the European Union, the bigger you see the share of the trade with Russia. Nowhere it's huge, but for example in Poland it's something like Russia, Ukraine, Belarus together, it's something like 5% of the exports, while Germany, it's only 2% of the exports. So it's in Poland, it's still not huge, but much more important than in Germany. Then there are the losses of European firms cancelling investment in Russia. For example, the French Renault had to cancel its investment, a loss of some 2.5 billion euro. Well, that's not good news for the economy, right? But actually, the black scenario is still ahead of us. I mean, it may happen if there is a disruption, if there's more disruption of the gas and oil supplies to Europe. For the time being, Russia cut the deliveries to Poland and Bulgaria only, somehow as we consider to punish us for being too helpful to Ukrainians and so on and so on. But it's not a big problem, even for Poland, because we can import the gas. We are building our pipelines that we can import a lot of the gas, sufficiently big amount of the gas from the other directions. But if Russia is reducing the supplies to the whole Europe, then obviously Poland is in trouble as everybody else. There is a risk in that such a situation of the economic slowdown or even a recession in the EU. And the International Monetary Fund is telling now that even without bigger disruptions of the oil and gas supplies, there may be a recession, a global recession this year, and especially hard for Europe because of the supply shock. And obviously, on the top of it, there's a cost of reconstruction of Ukraine. Do not expect the Russians to pay for the losses they did. The Europeans, first of all, and the Americans will have to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So the overall effect may be a slower growth, not for 1 year, for a couple of years, possible problems with inflation. Obviously, the more optimistic the scenario, the weaker the negative effects. Let's have a look simply a moment at this energy security issue. That's the key point here. The countries, obviously, the more the West, the less dependent on the Russian gas and oil the countries are. France, Spain, they've got their deliveries from the other sources, from North Africa, the gas and LNG from America, from North Africa, from the Gulf, and so on and so on. Here, the key problem is actually that Germany made an error over the last 20 years of linking itself very closely to the Russian gas. Germany is getting the gas from 3 major pipelines, but the most important of them is the northern one, the Nord Stream, under the Baltic Sea. And actually, what the Germans did, instead of building the terminals for the LNG, Poland did it, by the way. Lithuania did it, but Germany haven't constructed the natural liquid gas terminal, so they cannot ship it from the world. They've got some 50% of the deliveries of the gas coming from the North Sea mainly through the pipelines that are safe, and 50% going from the Russian pipelines, Russian gas, Russian controlled pipelines, and so on and so on. And now, if Russians reduce the deliveries of the gas from these free pipelines, then Germany doesn't have in the short run any way of filling the gap. I mean, okay, you can use the reserves, but basically half of the German use of the gas is coming from Russia. Germany started already constructing some ultra rapid construction of the LNG terminals, but it will take, this initial stages, I guess, at least half a year for the kind of temporary solutions, and 3-4 years for building the solid terminals. And the point is that even, we are in Poland. Poland is just now finishing constructing the pipeline from Norway, and moreover, we've got the big terminal for the liquid gas. So we can live without the Russian gas. Actually, in half a year, we'll be able to live without the Russian gas. But Germany, not. Germany will be able to live without the Russian gas only 3-4 years from now. And if there are the disruptions, what's happening if there are the disruptions of the liquid, of the gas to the country. First, the country must stop using the gas by the most energy-intensive industries, because basically all the countries have got the same policy. You deliver the gas to the households and so on, and first you stop delivering to the industry, and the more energy intensive industry, the more the first one it is in the line for cutting the deliveries. So, for example, the cement construction, the fertilizers. Those are the examples of the industries that are normally cut first from the deliveries of the gas if there are the shortages in the country. So the problem is that if there are shortages in the gas in Germany, then the German industry will be hard. And if the German industry is hard, the rest of Europe is in a recession. There's no doubt about that. So there is a risk here. We will see how it will develop, but from the economic point of view, the story is definitely not over. So what are the scenarios and longer run? Well, that's important for the development of Europe, because I would say I do not see at that moment an optimistic scenario. I see only a pessimistic and more pessimistic scenario. Obviously, there are some catastrophic scenarios, but let's hope that we are not going to discuss them. The pessimistic, but not dramatically pessimistic scenario is the scenario of the lasting tensions between Europe and Russia. So the military conflict will end, and there will be some buffer Ukraine, that we hope will join in 15 or 20 years' time the European Union. Maybe this Ukraine will be cut off some eastern provinces, but still it will be a kind of the country clearly moving towards the West. The slowdown of the growth in the EU will be only temporary, because this economic war with Russia will also kind of cool down. Obviously, the tension will continue, and the big energy projects will be cancelled. So no new gas from Russia, but the gradual fall of the feeling of the risk. The point with the Russian gas was the following: that Europe has got, as you know, a very ambitious climatic policy of becoming neutral for the climate by the year 2055. So how to achieve it? Well, to move from the energy that is polluting, means connected with the emission of the household gases, to the energy that's clean. And basically, the clean energy is all this clean energy that we know means the gas, the wind, the photovoltaic, and so on and so on. But the biggest, to some extent, the nuclear energy that some Europeans don't want to have. But the cleanest energy at site may be the hydrogen-based energy. But the point is that it's still, the technology requires a lot of the development, and the assessment is that before Europe can move to the hydrogen-based technologies from the coal and oil, Europe needs at least 20, 30 years, 20, 25 years of the transition period. And the policy until now was that in the meantime, Europe will switch from using more polluting fuels like the coal, for example, to less polluting fuels like the gas. And where to take this gas from Russia, because it's close by. And this policy, it seems, will be over, will be cancelled even after the lasting tension scenario, meaning that Europe will have to find some other temporary or this transitionary fuels between now and the hydrogen-based energy. It will be costly, obviously. It will cost more, so it means more costly energy, and more costly energy means less competitiveness and slower growth. But a more pessimistic scenario is that this conflict, in a sense, will not end so. And some beginning of the Cold War between Europe and Russia for decades. Ukraine may become either divided between the independent and some pro-Russian Ukraine, or the Russians will manage to make a puppet government in Ukraine. I mean, that was seems to have been their plan at the beginning. In any case, that may mean a long recession in the EU, reduce energy ties with much higher energy costs, with the disruption of the energy supply and with the with the recessionary effect, and the kind of long-term economic war between the West and Russia. And obviously, the less pessimistic the scenario, the less problems for us. But it depends on the politics, not on the economics. But let's stop with the war at that moment. But let's see. So what's the future of Europe it looks today? Okay, that was 5 biggest markets of the world in 1990. So Europe, it's a European Union actually. Okay, I still includes countries that are closely linked to the European EU economy, like the United Kingdom and Switzerland and Norway is included in this. So I call it Europe, okay? Europe had a GDP a bit bigger than the United States, but many, many times bigger than China, India, and Japan. Until now, what has happened was that basically Europe is still the same size, right, of on the graph. So the US and Europe are still the same size, but China joined the club, becoming the economy bigger than the United States and almost as big as Europe as far as the GDP is concerned. India has increased its size, although still considerably smaller than Europe, US, and China. If we believe in the long-term projections, they're not forecasts, they're projections. The projections are showing that if the trends continue, and by the year 2050, well, China and India will be the biggest economies in the world and markets, while Europe and the United States will not show lower. Obviously smaller. Obviously, given the bigger population, population in China and India, some 2 to 3 times bigger than the US and Europe, well, that means still the Chinese and the Indians are poorer than the Europeans and the Americans, but the global GDP will be higher produced there. The problem is the following. Does it mean that China will be the #1 economic power in the world at that time? Obviously, the Chinese want it. And definitely from the point of view of the GDP, there's little doubt that it will be the future. The point is, does it mean China is, on this graph, China is more powerful than the United States? And my answer is, there's no doubt China will produce more goods and services. But who will be the actual leader will depend on who will have the access to the newest technologies. And in this area, well, for the time being, okay, maybe China is producing already more than goods and services than the United States, but the Wall Street is in the US and the Silicon Valley is in the US. And Hollywood is in the US, and those are the kind of the centers of the creative industries, if you wish. So the profits are going where the inventors are, or the entrepreneurs and the innovators are. And from that point of view, the US is still a leader. Will China be a leader in 2050? We don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. Can Europe be a leader? Well, why not? But depending on what's going to happen. So what are the problems of Europe? That's for Europe of today. Why Europe is developing slower than the United States, for example. Okay, there's a big problem of I call it diversity, right? So this is the language map of Europe with some dialects that are clearly different from the other dialects shown in as separate colors. So the point is that it's difficult to build one economy with so many languages, right? And the language is not the biggest point. The biggest point is that are the different cultures. Once the Germans and the Spaniards and the Italians and the French and the others created a common currency, the euro. The key point was this common currency means two things. It means lower cost of the capital and means that the capital will flow freely from the areas when it is in the abundance into the areas in which there's a shortage of capital without any barriers, without any problems. And what has happened was that, the bottom line was, in the regions lacking the capital, where the investment is much more efficient, it's much more profitable, the capital will flow into them rather than being invested in areas when there's too much of the capital, when the profitability of investment is low, right? But somehow what has happened was that, for example, in Greece or Spain, this capital was not used for the investment, but basically for the consumption. Why? Because there is a different economic philosophy of those nations. I mean, the Germans or the Swiss would never use the capital in an irresponsible way for just improving the consumption level without asking themselves the question, what about the saving? What about paying back the debts? While the Italians, the Greeks, the Spaniards were much more eager to say, if there's a cheap capital, why don't we use it for improving our living standards rapidly? So, that's showing this diversity. That's a problem. If you compare Europe with the United States, with pretty unified market, with the consumers with similar tastes, with the similarly working institutions, with similarly thinking people, and so on, you can say that it's much more difficult to build a single economy in the area that is populated but by so different people, right? Okay, I mean, you can teach the people, you can force them somehow to change their habits, but it takes time. The second, and so that's the problem of it. But at the same time, it's obviously all the Europe's big asset. Because, and now let's look at it from the other angle. God, I mean, that's the cultural diversity that should be making people more creative, innovative. If you've got everywhere the same food, you will have problems. Imagining new and building a new type of a restaurant, right? Or a restaurant chain. Why? I mean, in the US, you would only think how big burger you will put and how you beat the competitors with a bigger burger or adding a bit more of the tomato ketchup, right? Or whatever. In Europe, in a sense, it's a mine of the ideas, right? I mean, you've got such a diversified region. If you've got so much to be learned from one nation by one nation from another, and so on, making people traveling, making students traveling through the Erasmus program and so on, it may enrich so much and make people more creative, more open-minded, and so on. So on the one hand, it's a problem. On the other hand, it's a big chance, right? Depending, either you can use this asset or not. So if you look at the assets, obviously there's an issue of the quality of life. Frankly speaking, some people would say Europe, especially some parts of Europe, because Europe is, as you see, is pretty diversified. I mean, let's not talk about poor Ukraine now, but even the quality of life in the southern countries like Romania, Bulgaria is much lower than in Poland, and in Poland obviously lower than Germany. But still, if you look at Europe on this map, this is the child mortality rate, for example, a very important parameter showing the functioning of the health sector. And the United States is spending 18% of GDP on the health, and they've got worse results in the sense of the child mortality rate and so on than Europe has. So, the quality of life in Europe is, well, arguably higher than the United States. The Americans, the United States is probably the only developed country without, in fact, without the guaranteed free holidays for the people. I mean, you can go on holidays, but basically the Americans, if I remember, take on the average some 10 days of holidays a year, while the French take famous 6 weeks and so on. So, I mean, people may complain about their wages, but you should also remember that the quality and that the Europeans have got more of the free time, more of the vacations, and so on. And the quality of life is as some people say, the highest in the world. Europe is not the center of knowledge. I mean, that's the key point I wanted to make, coming back to the issue of who will be the master, the ruler of the world. This is the kind of I like these maps that are showing the area of the countries proportional not to the area, but to the indicator we want to show. So this is the number of Nobel Prize winners. Okay, you can say that's history. Europe and as the number one, then the United States, America as the number two. The rest of the world, not very big one. But if you look, for example, now at the losers of world mapper is a funny site that you can find this type of maps, then still you find Europe as the biggest place for this type of creative thinking. Okay, look at the published scientific articles, and you still got Europe number one before, although China and India are already sizable. And moreover, if you look at the dynamics of the publications, then China is obviously number one, but Europe is not bad. So in a sense, with all this fragmentation of the European educational system and so on, Europe is still a center of knowledge, one of the global centers of knowledge, in a sense, not much behind the United States. Remember the Chinese story? The issue is not about that the Europeans are not inventing. The issue is that the Americans know how to change the inventions into the Facebooks, Microsofts, what else? Intels and so on, and Teslas. So, to make the last point about the resources of Europe, the assets of Europe. Europe is really Europe has got a lot of the capital, actually more than the United States. This is the map of the banks and ATMs in Europe. And actually, this is not really showing the amount of the capital that you've got. But just remember that Europe has got the surplus, the small surplus of the capital above its needs. While, for example, the United States have got the shortage of the capital. The United States is importing the capital from the rest of the world. So, in a sense, Europe has got a lot of the assets, and the point is how to use them efficiently. But Europe has also the problems. The state. The state in Europe is bigger than in any other continent. This is the size of the expenditures of the state. This was just one of the indicators. We know that the Europeans somehow build huge welfare states, and on the one hand, it's making the life nicer, more security, and so on. On the other hand, it's costly. It's a lot of the taxes put on the business, on the labor, on the profits, so on, and making the continent less competitive. There's the issue of the bureaucracy. And I would say, the bureaucracy is the red tape, if you wish. Some countries in Europe is better situation, some countries it's less, and in Scandinavia has got the wonderfully working state institutions, Britain, German. The point is they are different from every country. And actually, some countries have got pretty inefficient bureaucracy. We've got in Poland pretty inefficient bureaucracy. Southern Europe has got pretty inefficient bureaucracy. Some countries have got much more. In any case, definitely, this is the famous ease of doing business, the World Bank indicator. The World Bank is no longer doing it, unfortunately, but it's another story. In any case, it's showing that Europe definitely is lagging behind, for example, the United States, Europe as a whole, in the functioning of the state's institutions. And moreover, there's a problem of the different approach to this role of the state. And it's visible in the European Union, in Brussels, when, for example, the French, who have got much more tendency to believe in the strong hand of the state, have been always quarreling with the British, at the time British were in Brussels, who wanted more of this, Anglo-Saxon light approach of the state to the bureaucracy. And the German model is another one, and so on, so on. So basically, not only the size of it, but also the differences that make the life more difficult for the business. And the segmentation. I will show the same map than before. Before I said that's the big advantage of Europe, but that's a problem of Europe as well. And despite the fact that the European Union has been existing for 66 years already, there are still a lot of the obstacles for delivering of many, for example, services between the countries. And there are some other problems like the policy coordination. You know, Europe is not the United States. Europe is not even a federation. The European Union is kind of a group of countries that are always searching for the consensus on various issues. And the point is that sometimes finding consensus is difficult, and sometimes you need a rapid decision, like during a crisis, financial crisis. And in Europe, it's not working this way. There's a lot of barriers in existing. There's the problem of entrepreneurial spirit. We're always telling that, unfortunately, a lot of the people with entrepreneurial spirit emigrated from Europe to the United States in the 19th and early 20th century, but the issues here now all go about the education, about the kind of the supporting the entrepreneurial the spirit, the image of the entrepreneur as a hero rather than as a suspicious person. The issue of the education, of the science, of technology, as I said, I mean, still we've got the universities in Europe that are not bad, not worse than the United States, but the innovations are made in the Silicon Valley, and actually there's no Silicon Valley in Europe. And obviously the issue of the security now raised now made even stronger by the Russian aggression. However, you know, the United States also have been attacked in 2001. So, you know, we simply must live with that. So a lot of barriers, a lot of the assets are still, I'm eager to say that Europe could be a stronger growing economy, can be one of the leaders in the technology in the world, but Europe needs to reduce its problems and to make a better use of its assets. It's possible, although it would require a lot of the work. Okay, that's what I wanted to show and tell you. Now, if there are some comments or questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Let me start the chat. Okay, hello. The real problem of the EU is a huge burden of administrative regulation, high taxation. Well, okay, I mean, taxation depends on the country. This is not the EU. The EU itself is only 1% of the GDP. It's a tiny tax, if you wish, that the European nations are paying for the European Union. The rest depends on the country. And moreover, there are huge differences. In the same EU, you've got, for example, countries like Ireland or the Baltic states with some 35% of the tax to GDP ratio, the government revenue. And you've got France with almost 60% of this. So 1 to 2, and that depends on the country. So I would say let's not blame the EU for something that depends on the decision of the nations, right? Okay, but okay, and coming back to the regulations. Well, frankly speaking, yes and no. I mean, there's no doubt that there is this issue of as I said, of the German versus German versus French versus Anglo-Saxon approach to the regulations, with some nations pushing for much more of the regulations, some nations being much more relaxed about that and eager to have much lighter regulations. You know, there is the famous story of the banana shape in the European Union. This is the myth. First, this is the myth. This is not true. And secondly, I mean, this is not true that Europe started regulating the bananas. And secondly, there is some truth in this, but it's also showing how the union is working. the issue was simple, that France wanted to have more banana imported from its former colonies in Africa than from Latin America. And it happened that due to some biological reasons, the bananas from Africa were somehow not as curvy as bananas from Latin America. And the French were simply using this as a pretext. I mean, they were trying to cheat the others in a sense by pushing for some regulations under the cover that this is to help the shops, the trade to deal with the bananas. They were trying to actually to get something that sounds absurd, right? But if you simply think that, okay, I mean, what they really wanted to get was to have more bananas from here than from here, then it's becoming much more a normal, business type of a struggle. I mean, every company is trying to get the competitor to get some legislation that is supporting its products and making life more difficult for the products of the competition. I mean, every company is kind of trying to lobby for something like that. So it's nothing strange. Somehow it was changed into a story about how absurd the EU is, that it wants to control the size of the bananas just because they want to control everything. And that was actually not true. But the truth is that there is always the struggle and obviously there is always an attempt to make the regulator somehow introduce the regulation. In the United States, it's also happening, but maybe it's not so. Those are not the countries that are negotiating it, but the firms lobbying for something like that in Washington. Is there too much of the regulations in Europe? Well, frankly speaking, we are exaggerating. The good regulations is something in the interest of a consumer, right? For this smartphone and this telephone, you need two different adapters, right? And moreover, for the old telephones, for many years, each producer was making a different sock for the adapter to sell his own adapters. Actually, after many years, the European Union managed to force the regulation, forcing the producers to have one type of the sock. But unfortunately, the iPhones are still using their own socks that are, and I'm not sure how the European Union, I mean, what's the deal when they will be forced to use the same socks in Europe. And this is not for the bureaucrats to make the life nicer for them. This is for us to make the life nicer, simpler, and cheaper if we don't have to use to buy two separate adapters, depending either we move from one type of the telephone, of the smartphone, to another one, right? So, let's not exaggerate. I mean, good regulations are necessary to make the life, to make the market working properly. But obviously, too much of them, and this French approach maybe of an attempt to make too many regulations, it's also seen in the Union. Will disruptions related to supply of oil and gas from Russia affect the faster development of alternative energy sources in the EU, the nuclear power? My answer is probably yes. But you remember the whole story I said. The issue is the EU is not changing its target of being climatic neutral 25 years from now. The point is that given that the Russian gas most likely will not be available, there will be first probably more money in an attempt to speed up the development of the alternative technologies for the energy. And secondly, probably an effort to make the life easier in this transitional period. And from that point of view, for example, the nuclear energy may be more acceptable. But the point is, this is not the EU. I mean, this is the national decision. The Germans decided, if I remember, 10 years ago or less, they don't want the nuclear energy. They want to close their nuclear power plants. Now, who knows? Maybe with the new crisis, the Germans will decide that for this this is not forever. This is for this 25 years, right? And maybe the Germans will decide that they will allow the nuclear power plants to work 10 years longer than previously announced, just to avoid a situation of a shortage of the power in Germany. It's possible. The same. It's possible that some decarbonization may be slowed down, not reversed, not eliminated, slowed down. So, for example, 5 more years for the use, or 10 more years of the use of the coal in generating the power, however it's being done. And I guess there may be some change in this transition path from the current energy to the clean energy of the future. And the next question is, would you invest real money in the real estate sector in Poland now? If the times are difficult, and we live in difficult times, there is no safe investment. The point is that if there is inflation, you never know what will be the safe investment. Like the real estate, maybe a market that is under pressure to develop so-called speculative bubble, meaning prices going higher up than price of assets than a reasonable level. If they go too high, then somewhere in the future they will fall, right? So in a sense, if you ask me, is it more profitable in Poland now to buy the real estate than to keep the money in the banking account? My answer will be most likely. I'm not an investment advisor, but if you ask this question, I would say, okay, drinking coffee and just without any responsibility for the advice, I would tell you yes, probably today, yes. But if you ask me, but are you sure that if I keep this for 10 years, this real estate, this flat or house, I will earn more than by keeping the bank account? My answer is, I don't know. Nobody knows. Depending partly on what will be the price at which you buy the real estate. Because if this price, if they look to be too high already compared to the kind of long-term trend, then maybe you are there already overpriced and they will fall back. But still, I would say most likely today it's better to buy the real estate, but in 3 years' time the situation may change. Okay, I do not see another question. Yes. Would you advise to set up a business in Europe, or would you suggest to look over to other parts of the world? The point is that if you've got good business idea, you can make business in Poland, in the United States, in India, in China, everywhere. If you've got the idea. Obviously, the issue is where it is easier for you to make this business. And from the point of view of the regulations, there's no doubt that it will be easier in the United States and in Europe. But from the point of view of the culture of people with whom you are working and your understanding of this culture, it will be probably easier for you to do it in Poland than in the United States. From the point of view of how easy it is to find the new customers and so on, most likely it will be easier to make it in China. But from the point of view how to deal with the corrupt officers, state officers, and so on, I would say China is probably not the best place to do it. So, I would say definitely, depending on what are you searching for, there is no one answer to the question, it's better to set up a business on Europe or in the United States, for example. Depending on what type of business, what do you need for this business, what's more important, are you in the areas in which you've got to get a lot of the government approvals and so on and so on? Is it in the areas in which you've got to have massive, very easy access to the technology or not? Depending on many questions, it may appear that Europe is better, or the US is better, or China is better. Obviously, each of the areas have got its advantages. And from that point of view, from what I said, it's in my presentation, it should be clear for you that unfortunately, Europe has got less of this type of assets than for example, America or than America, first of all. But doesn't mean that you can't set up a wonderfully operating company in Europe. Well, Grishna, I guess we are close to the end of the questions, and we are close to the end of the time. So over to you, if you are here. No, I cannot see anybody. So, well, I guess we were expected to have this meeting until 6:15. So if there is no question, anybody else wanted to make any comment or question? If not, then I'm very happy that you've been with me. Thank you very much for the participation. And I wish you all the best in those difficult times. Well, thank you and bye-bye.